Hello, everyone. This is Mark, KD2MGH, and this is going to be a brief introduction to ham radio for people that don't know much about it yet. So, to start off with, we'll introduce Henry Kurtz, who they named the Hertz cycles per second after. He was a German physicist, uh, and he proved the existence of the electromagnetic wave, the electromagnetic field. He built on the work of James Clerk Maxwell, who did a lot with magnetism and electrical theory. Uh, After that, Mr. Marconi here in 1888 got the amateur ball rolling with the amateur wireless telegraph. They still couldn't do a lot of good stuff with voice over uh, radio transmissions, but they were able to do some wireless telegraph, which is how ham radio actually started in the late 1800s. Ham's been around ever since. It's been through two world wars, the space race, the Cold War, and up through until today. And luckily, uh, all the radios have improved dramatically. Looking at the Zenus next to this guy, uh, we have a lot better equipment and probably easier to operate now. So, up until very recently, uh, ham radio rigs, such as the one you see here, were very expensive, hard, very complicated, and really took someone who had some deep devotion to the hobby to get going with ham radio. You had to know a lot of theory, and you really had to put forth an effort to get your ham license. You had to know CW or Morse code. But in the past few years, they've stopped requiring Morse code for your ham license, and all these uh, low low cost radios have come on the market, Baofengs and TYTs and a lot of these radios from China. They're not the same quality as the bigger brand names, but they work pretty well. They work well enough where people who don't have a lot of time and money to spend on the hobby can still pick one of these up for 30, $50, $100 for a good base unit and get on the air and talk. And the ham radio license is easier than ever to get. So how does ham radio work? In the simplest mode, which is called Simplex, that's a radio talking to another radio point to point using one frequency. And this is fairly simple, fairly straightforward. You have the radio on the left transmitting on 144.200 megahertz, for example, and you have the radio on the right receiving 144.200 megahertz. This is a very simple type of transmission, not very complicated. This is what the FRS radios or family radio service radios you might buy at Walmart use generally to talk back and forth. And it works pretty well, especially for short distances. For longer distances, or distances that have some feature that blocks radio transmission, it's better to have a repeater mounted somewhere. So a repeater is a way station for the radio signal. So the guy on the left here is transmitting from his portable radio, puts out 5 watts at 146.25 megahertz, and that's the station he's sending out on from his portable radio. Radio says it's 5 watts. Generally, we think of 1 watt will travel about 1 mile, and this is very dependent on line of sight transmission of that 1 watt or 5 watts or whatever. If anything gets in the way, trees, houses, small hill, birds, weather, that number will be diminished and you won't get as far. Also, a lot of the Chinese radios kind of overstate what their wattage is. So, a lot of the low cost both Baofengs claim a 5 watt transmit power, but it may only be 2 or 3 at times. You have to read literature and find people who actually bought the radio and tested it to find out if their claims are true and when they were true, because there's a lot of revisions back and forth. They may have had radios that weren't very good, but then they had a shipment of components that were really top of the line, and their maybe Bofang got better for a while, and then they lost that shipment, and now they have 3 watts instead of 5. So the guy on the left, he's transmitting out 146.25 megahertz at 5 watts up to the repeater at the top of this mountain here. He hits the repeater. The repeater immediately switches it over to another frequency, 146.85, which is pretty close to 146.25. And the repeater is a base unit, has a big battery backup or a generator backup. It's a big cement building that it's sitting in with a big antenna line and the antenna way up on top of this mountain, and it puts out 100 watts, so this can get way far away. And the reason why we don't have the repeater sending the signal back out over the same frequency that you go into it is because the guy on the left that's sending the signal is talking and talking and talking, and the repeater wants to send it out immediately. If he sends it back out over 146.25, he's going to get walked over by himself. There's going to be 2 transmissions going over one frequency, and it's not going to work. So a repeater has an offset, which is a frequency that's close to the one that it's using to receive the radio signal. And usually we talk about offset in plus or minus kilohertz or megahertz offset. So this is 0.6 megahertz or 6 kilohertz offset. So if you add 0.25 and add 0.6, you get 0.85, which is the offset. And the guy on the right can hear what the guy on the left is saying almost immediately, just because of the repeater being able to transmit as soon as it receives, and that the electromagnetic spectrum, like all wavelengths, even light wavelengths, travel at the speed of light. So radio waves travel at the speed of light. So inside a repeater, in a simplified format here, you have a receive side and a transmit side. You have an in and an out. So say the repeater is set up to receive 144.100 megahertz. So you have a signal coming in on the left on the receive side, and these 2 radios are tied together, and it goes in through the in, sends it out to the transmit side or the outside to the out terminal, and that gets sent out at 144.7 megahertz, which is a positive 6 kilohertz offset. So if you're scanning or you're just listening because you don't have your license but you still want to hear kind of what the ham radio is doing until you can get your test set up, I would go with the output for the repeater. The output is generally a lot higher power, and you're going to get both sides of the conversation this way. So this red line on the left-hand side, imagine that coming from the input of the repeater. Here's the output. It gets put out over 144.7 megahertz, and you can pick it up with the scanner or your receive-only radio, and you don't have to worry about transmitting, so you don't have to worry about an offset. A couple places on the web you can find a lot of frequencies. One is radioreference.com. So here you can find exactly where in the country you are, down to the town, and search, and it'll give you a listing of all the public safety trash pickup, buses, company companies that use radio, ham radio transmissions, all kinds of stuff. Fire department, ambulance, all that. So when you go to radioreference.com, up towards the top here, you will see a circle here. It says input frequency, and it's defaults to hidden. If you click on that, you can transfer it over to shown, and then down here under the frequencies, you'll have an additional column that'll show the inputs. And if you're going to be transporting it or transmitting on any of these, you would need the input as well as the frequency. This frequency is just the output, and a lot of these things, especially law enforcement, public safety, all that, a lot of them do use repeaters. So if you're just listening, which if you're listening to police, I would say just to save yourself a lot of grief, don't put the transmit frequency in, because they love to be able to track you down, and then or you have to explain why you have transmit on your radio for police. Other real good website is Repeater Book, and you can get apps on your phone for these too. But Repeater Book is exclusively amateur radio, no public safety at all, but exclusively amateur radio, and these will give you the offset already put in. They're assuming that you're a ham radio operator and you understand what to do with the, all these numbers and stuff here. So if you look at, let's say, the Bristol Warden Hill, which is about halfway down the page, you see it's the frequency is 154.11 megahertz, and it is a 0.6 megahertz negative offset. So take away 6 from take away 0.6 from 145.11, and you get the frequency you have to transmit to get into that repeater. The CTCSS tone, which is the tone up, tone down, is 110.9, and these CTCSS tones are subaudible tones that get put in that are sometimes needed to open up that radio so they can hear that transmission. If you have a choice and you're able to, only put this on the transmit and not the receive. Once in a while, some repeaters won't have the tone transmitted out. So if you put 110.9 on, and for some reason that repeater doesn't transmit out 110.9, just doesn't use transmit CTCSS tone, you'll be listening all day and it will never open up your radio because it's waiting for that tone to drop to be able to open up the radio so you can hear. So I would recommend only putting the CTCSS or the CT tones on transmit. So that's Bristol, in the Bristol Mountains, Warden Hill, that's county is Ontario, it's WR2AHL, great repeater, very active, a lot of good guys on there. And if you notice way at the bottom, we have Whiteface Mountain in Wilmington, New York, Essex County, and that one, it shows down at the bottom there on the right-hand side, is closed. I think during the winter, they had a huge fire there, and it burned down a good portion of their skiing area. And I'm assuming that their repeater was probably stored within that building, or the fire somehow caused that to not be in use currently until they rebuild up there. So if you look at your radio, you got a face that looks kind of like this. You have your upper frequency and lower frequency. And this is just kind of a mock-up to show you kind of what you're looking at. Down below the little antenna up in the left upper side, it says CT. That means it has that subaudible tone, the CT-CSS activated. You'd have to actually go into the radio to find out what the CT-CSS was. And I'm going to tell you now, for this scenario, it'll be set at 110.9. The frequency, the upper frequency, the little arrow just below the CT is pointing up, which means you're looking at the top band, and that's the 144.700. The offset, if you look just above the 7, you see a little minus symbol there. That means that it's offset, a negative offset. You'd have to go into the radio again to find out exactly what it is. And the offset is negative 6 kilohertz. So it'll be actually transmitting out at 144.100. But it receives at 144.700. So when the repeater transmits, it's going to transmit on 144.700 with a CT-CSS or a CT subaudible tone of 110.9 to be able to open the radio up to hear that. To the right of that negative symbol above the 7, you have an R and you have a W. W is for wide band. So this gives it a very wide spectrum deviation for your frequency, and that gets a little more power out there. For a lot of commercial bands, the FCC has limited everything to narrow band, which is like 12.5 steps, and that's because they're worried that so many places are using radio that they didn't have the bandwidth available to have everyone using wide band, so they're going to narrow. But ham, we have all our own stuff. Everyone shares well. We can still go with wide. If you have a choice, program your radio with wide, because that's going to give you a little better power output and audio output. And on the far right, on the top, just below the battery symbol, there's 19, which is actually, this is put in channel 19, and the bottom frequency is 440.100, and that is actually put in the channel 10 spot. And then upper right is the battery, so it looks like fully charged. On the left, you have your transmit power. Has that little antenna with a couple bars coming out, and when you transmit, that'll show up and it'll say, that's you're going full power with that. So if we change the radio around a little bit, now we put in an alphanumeric display with this. So if the repeaters are usually named after either the call sign of the person that set it up, or the call sign of the radio club that set the repeater up. Repeater or repeaters. So if I was going to set up a repeater today, again, my call sign is KD2MGH. I would register my repeater with everyone online and everything so everyone can find it and use it. I'd put the CT-CSS tones in, and the CT-CSS tones are generally put in by your regional coordinator. So Rochester has one set of CT-CSS tones that they recommend using for everything, just so people can find a repeater, use it pretty easily, and still have the tones, so they don't get a lot of transmissions kind of seeping in from other places. So Ontario and Wayne counties have a different CT-CSS, as well as North Country, Buffalo, Syracuse. They all have a different tone, but they recommend to use the same tone for that region. And not everyone does it. Some people do something a little differently. If there's a, a repeater from a radio club somewhere that wants it to be more exclusive to that local region, and they don't want a lot of outsiders coming in over it if they don't really know uh, exactly, what this is. They'll change out the tone a little bit. Um, so for this one, um, if I had a repeater, I'd program it in. I'd put on there my call sign, so I know, when I'm going through, I can dial it up, and instead of remembering all these numbers, I can say, oh, that's the KD2MGH repeater, or the whatever the call sign is. And I also did a little hyphen here and RLC for Rochester. And I'll do that occasionally because, especially like my car, I'm traveling. I'll travel to Ohio, Kentucky, Syracuse, uh, Adirondacks, and I have stations programmed in for all those places. So I have a dash O for everything in Ohio. I have a dash K for everything in Kentucky. Uh, I have a dash 80K for everything in the Adirondacks. So that's about all I have. I hope this was nice and quick and informative. Uh, I hope everyone is either has their license or is working on their license. Study. I would recommend the app for your phone that does test prep. Because it's really nice to be able to sit down. You have nothing to do for 15 minutes. Go through and rattle through some test questions. I found doing that a couple times a day for a couple days, you're more than ready to go in and take either the tech or the general licenses and be pretty confident in your ability to pass on the first time. Okay, good luck everyone. 73s, K2 MGH clear.